Hello, welcome to week one of The Wargame, our new podcast collaboration between Sky News and Tortoise that simulates a Russian attack on the UK and what would happen. And I mean, I can't think of a better time to do a podcast like this when things here in the UK, but also around the world, feel like they're in such a precarious place when it comes to security and defence. I'm so excited by this podcast, and I can tell that you guys are too, because we've had an awful lot of questions that have come in to ask to the two people who know more about this podcast than anybody else. Deborah Haynes, our security and defence editor here at Sky News, someone I'm sure you're very familiar with, and also James Shield, who is a producer at Tortoise, who's also been working at this. So I've got loads of questions that people have asked, which are some great questions as well, about the podcast and about wider issues about our own defence and about Russia and all that kind of stuff. But just firstly, can you just explain to all of us what this podcast is all about? Debs, how did you come up with the idea of it?
Well, I mean, I've been a defence journalist for many years. I've been a journalist for 25 years, and I've covered a lot of conflict in that time: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, also, of course, events in Ukraine over the last 3 years in particular, and as well covering defence at home, on the home front. And over that time, you've seen, like, following the end of the Cold War, this disinvestment in defence because of the peace dividend and reprioritising funding elsewhere. And so a loss of military capability and also just national awareness in why defence matters. And what we've seen over the last few years, as you kind of alluded to, is an increase in the threat that is, posing to the home front the kind of danger that was daily life in the Cold War, and yet there's not the same currency of understanding. So the idea came about really as a way to try to, talk about the reality of the threat and what the reality of cutting our armed forces means when it comes to responding and deterring threat. And then also the reliability of our allies. I mean, that's come into light a lot, especially with Donald Trump back in the White House. And, understandably saying to Europe, you need to do more to defend yourself. Yeah. But equally, it's worrying times for people here.
It's so interesting because, we've spoken about this before as well, Debs, because, you've been to all these conflict zones, you talk to your military sources all the time. And then you have someone like me who's very kind of domestic focused, and, it does feel like war can be an awful long way away, like a kind of reality that happened to people in the past. But what this podcast, I guess, shows is that that's not necessarily the case. And you've been speaking to all these different politicians, experts, just to explain how it all works.
Yeah, so the first step was really working with an Oxford academic called Rob Johnson, and he's got a lot of experience of working in the Ministry of Defence and running war games. And it's interesting that when the government wants to know what might happen if we were attacked, they run a war game, or if there was a pandemic, if there was some other sort of emergency.
So the government runs war games for themselves?
They run war games all the time for all sorts of situations, and really this sort of started by, with a conversation between Deborah and Rob Johnson about, could we run a war game in public? Because normally they're all run behind closed doors, and perhaps they discuss things that are classified. Nothing in our war game is classified. But we thought if we could do that in public, that's a way for listeners, for everyone watching and listening to sort of see what would happen, what could happen.
Yeah, and we've got loads of questions. It feels like maybe we can go to the first one now, because this is about the kind of making of the podcast, which is so interesting as well, I guess, because, as you say, you've got all these figures playing different roles in the war game. The first question that I got was from someone called Roz T, who's asked, how did you get all of these politicians to sign up? So firstly, say who's in it, and how did you persuade them?
Sure, it's a good question. I mean, that's, I think, the credibility of the series. I mean, obviously, it rides on the person that created the war game, which is Rob Johnson, as James was saying. But also, we needed to make sure we had the right players with the relevant experience. And so my idea from the beginning was that Ben Wallace would be an ideal person to approach to see if he'd be up for being our fictional
former
Prime Minister.
Defence Minister, of course, Secretary of State under the Conservatives, yeah.
Yeah, and before that, Security Minister during the Skripal poisoning. So he had plenty of he was very instrumental in the British response to Russia's war in Ukraine, and then before that with the poisoning of that Russian double agent in Salisbury. So I asked him, would he be up for it? I mean, it's a bit of a mad thing to ask, like, do you fancy...
By the way.
It's a little question here. Would you be up for taking part? And I think it's because the idea is so different that he loved it from the beginning and said yes. And then off the back of that, I went to Jack Straw, who I know that. So Ben and Jack know each other well and get on well. I mean, Jack Straw is a veteran politician in the Labour Party. So he was Foreign Secretary under Tony Blair and also a former Home Secretary. And I've known him since 2004 when I was based in Iraq and he would come out as Foreign Secretary. And so I asked him if he would be up for it. And then they asked Mark Sedwill, who's a former national security advisor, who I've had the pleasure of meeting when he was in that role and very well regarded. And so he again liked the idea. And then I approached Richard Barrons, so that's General Sir Richard Barrons, who a former top military officer and has just finished actually writing the government's actual defence review. And again, he was up for it too, and then off the back of that, we had other politicians and officials that signed up for it. And I think everybody was just taken with the idea of this being a different way of telling, a very familiar story, but in a way that hopefully captures the imagination and helps to inform.
Yeah, and it really does live or die on the quality of the people you get around the table and the experience that they bring, which obviously is why it's something that I'm so excited to listen to more. Right, James, Yartos Fandango has asked, how closely does the fictional conflict align with current UK military doctrine or wargaming practices? Were any real-world exercises or classified strategies used as inspiration? Which I guess kind of feeds on from what you were saying.
Yeah, well, obviously nothing in the wargame is classified, but you only need to read the papers to see stories about wargames that the government has conducted. I think it was in the Times only a month or so ago that the RAF had wargamed what if the first day of the Russian attack on Kyiv had happened to a city in the UK and found that there were gaps in our air defences. So we know that the government has wargamed situations like that. But the game is put together, as I say, by an academic with a lot of experience of running war games.
That's if you're talking about the guy who's just written the defence review, the former national security advisors, former defence secretaries. I mean, they've been in these rooms before, right? So.
Yeah, and also we have obviously a Russia team, and our Russia team is made up of experts on Russia and Russia's ways of war, but also crucially people that, when governments do these war games for real, these are people they draw on to play it's called the Red Team. So our British Blue Team against the Russian Red Team. And so they were instrumental as well. And actually our war game is, obviously the war game, the idea of the game is to produce a podcast. And so there are obviously slight differences. Like James said, nothing is classified in our war game, but also the Russia team, it knew beforehand the main moves it would make. Yeah. But the British team, they don't know what's coming.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of leads on to the next question, actually, from Louis. He says, how did you balance dramatic tension with realism? How did you keep it plausible?
Well, I think it had to feel real for the players, first of all, because we've got people, as Deborah's saying, kind of Ben Wallace, Jack Straw, Mark Sedwill, Amber Rudd as well, a real former Home Secretary, who between them have been in dozens and dozens of real Cobra meetings. So even though it's a podcast, for them it had to look and sound real. So we had a look at, as far as I can tell, there's only one picture of the real Cobra meeting room that you can see publicly. And because initially we thought, should we do this in a kind of disused nuclear bunker? Should we do it in the Churchill war rooms? And actually it's just a sort of quite a modern looking meeting room in a basement.
Which is real. That's what it would be like, right?
That's real. So for them it had to feel like this could be a real situation. They had maps, they could see the US Secretary of State down the line, NATO, and crucially they didn't see the Russian team, the Red Team, all day. So we did this in a big basement, and kind of all the way on the other side of the basement were the Russians. So for them it felt real. Clearly, if you listen, it's a dramatic thing to listen to, but I think probably war games are a sort of inherently dramatic thing. So we didn't really change what we war gamed to make it more dramatic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Although we had news reports. They were quite key, weren't they?
Yeah,
Was that done by you, or was it someone else?
No,
who
we
got to do it?
had. We actually there was one of the staff at Tortoise is a former BBC newsreader, and she's got a brilliant voice. So she very kindly voices.
Oh, I love it.
And then we also we've got like it's like a fictional rolling news channel that gives breaking news when things happen. You have to listen to things up. But then we also just like we're thinking, because obviously information is part of the battle space.
Yeah.
And so we had obviously the British news reports, but then we also mocked up Russian state media news reports too. And we went to an expert in Russian state media called Valery Yakimenko, who he was instrumental in helping us craft credible Russian state media reports, again, to give the Russian perspective on what was happening here.
So Keith F has asked, some people will say that this is scaremongering. What's your response? And this is an important question to ask as well, particularly at a time when a lot of people from the military backgrounds are demanding more money to be spent on defence at the expense of other public service as well. So what would you say to Keith that some people would say is scaremongering, Debs?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And obviously, I don't want to do anything that would, give secrets away to the Russians. I mean, that would be, that's absolutely not what this is about. This is about not scaremongering. The reality is quite frightening at the moment. And I think the danger is that unless you think about it, just think about it. We're not saying, so the scenario, it's important to state, the scenario itself, it's extremely low likelihood, but high consequence. I mean, a high impact. So a very low chance of it happening, but catastrophic consequences if it did. And I think for me, I've been, threat is capability plus intent, and we can see that Russia has the capability. Ukraine is suffering the consequences of that capability every day, and nobody can say what the Russian intent might be when it comes to challenging NATO. You hear from military chiefs and politicians that that Vladimir Putin might seek to challenge NATO in the coming years. The Russian embassy last week, in response to the government's defence review, came out with a statement saying that Russia absolutely did not had no plans to attack the UK, and why would they? But then you also have to remember that Vladimir Putin, on the eve of his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, told the world that his troops massing at Ukraine's border were just there for an exercise. So the world is dangerous. The reality is, since the end of the Cold War, we switched from being a population that was ready for war, ready for the worst kind of war, like nuclear war. And we had this period of relative peace, and our society flourished and enjoyed and embraced that and was able to focus on other areas. But the reality is changing, as we can see around us. And so rather than be scaremongering, it's more a sober, credible, carefully crafted analysis and exercise into the reality of the threat.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in a way, it's not scaremongering if it is actually quite scary out there at the minute. And Debs was just saying that, she wouldn't want to put anything out that could help the Russians, right? Which is the question from B. Jack. He said, potential enemies will no doubt be studiously interested in this podcast. Does the war game risk doing their work for them?
Well, the thing we say at the start of every episode is Russia knows our weaknesses, but do you? So everything that's in the war game that plays out, you could read about it in reports, in documents. It's been covered in the news. Deborah's covered it an awful lot. So there's Parliament.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in here that isn't known. That couldn't be known.
Defence Review.
Yeah.
I mean,
the Defence Review is all about this. And so the point is, hopefully, listeners, in hearing this, you will know what the weaknesses are. And, in a democracy, you deserve to know what the state of our defences are, just as much as you know
transparency thing as well.
And also, as well, I would say, if some people listen to this and learn something, and there is a sense that the society becomes a bit more resilient, then actually it's absolutely benefiting our country to the detriment of our enemies.
Debs, if you could answer this question honestly, this is from Jake Smith. If Russia attacked us tomorrow, would we be ready in terms of defence and supplies? What do you think?
No. I mean, it's stated in the Defence Review. It literally says in black and white that we are not ready for war at the moment. I mean, that's the reality, and that's what the Veterans Minister recently said that if the UK army was in a full-scale war, a high-intensity war, then it would last about 6 months. So
Wow.
it's not, and that's, again, it's not scaremongering at all. It's like, it's important to answer that, though, to explain the answer. So up until the end of the Cold War, the military, the armed forces of the UK and the NATO alliance were configured to fight a high-intensity war against the Soviet Union. That's an expensive endeavour. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, then successive governments didn't feel they needed to sustain such a military force that could literally go to war in an instant. And so that readiness was reduced, and the sizes of the military across Europe were reduced. And then our military changed. The purpose of armed force then became to deploy to foreign countries, to sort of intervene, wars of choice, so-called wars of choice, not thinking of the home front. And so the armed forces that we have today are, as a result of the last 30, 40 years of evolution and change. And what is being argued now by those inside defence and outside too, who have a grasp of history, is that reality has changed, the threat has changed, and therefore the armed forces need to reconfigure to confront that threat.
So honestly, just hearing the reality of the situation and the starkness of your answer there, and as you say, it's laid out in the Defence Review as well, it's really quite something. I imagine that it's been even more explored and even more got across by doing this exercise as well, when you're kind of working out what resources you do have to deploy, what supplies you have, what people you have. What someone has asked, called AMB, A-M-B, maybe it's an ambassador, you never know. He's asked, what could be the first target that Russia would go for?
Wouldn't necessarily be the obvious target. I think that's something that I've learned as a sort of non-defence specialist making the podcast, was our Russia team, led by Keir Giles, who's a senior fellow at Chatham House. What they're trying to do in the war game is, as much as possible, follow the Russian playbook. And war in the 21st century isn't all about missiles and bombs. It's also about cyber warfare, information warfare. It's about critical national infrastructure. Yeah. It's, you kind of see all the different ways in which they've attacked Ukraine. And so I don't think it's anything, I don't think it's giving anything away to say in the first sort of 15, 20 minutes of the first episode of the war game, we hear on the radio that 2 F-35 pilots have been killed in the world of the game. And that's how events begin, and that's the reason why the first Cobra meeting is called. It's
so interesting about the changing nature of warfare, because I know that you know this more than me, but from the people that I've interviewed in the security world or the defence world, some of them are saying it's not a question of when we go to war with Russia. We are at war with Russia now, effectively, and it's that kind of disinformation, isn't it? The information warfare that is going on all the time, right? Frank B asks Debs, how would NATO react? Would they follow the doctrine? An attack on one NATO member is an attack on all of us. I mean, this is such a key question at the minute as well, isn't it?
It is really key, and I won't give anything away in terms of what actually happens in our scenario. But I think it's a thing that I hadn't properly appreciated, and I'm someone that covers defence, so I don't know what that says about me. But Article 5 is one of the founding principles of the alliance, which was an alliance that grew up following the end of the Second World War, when you had the Western Allies were confronted with the Warsaw Pact countries, and they formed this alliance and they agreed to defend each other. And Article 5 spells out that if a member state of NATO is under armed attack, then it can invoke Article 5, and all allies can choose to come to that ally's defence. But what I hadn't appreciated was that all the members of NATO need to agree before Article 5 can be invoked. And then even if it is invoked, it doesn't mean that you automatically give weapons or send military force. You can just send warm words.
This is it. And I think I'm right in saying that the only time it's actually been used is with the US, right?
Yep, so after the September the 11th attacks in 2001. And I don't believe it was even actually the US that initiated the invoking of Article 5, which I think is quite telling.
Yeah.
It was the NATO allies, as part of their rallying to the support of America at its time of crisis. invoked Article 5 of the collective defence. So it has never been used for the purpose that it was originally established. And there's a NATO summit coming up in a couple of weeks, and you will see at the summit, I believe, an update of the NATO doctrine when it comes to dealing with the things that you were talking about, the sort of the under the threshold of armed conflict kind of responses. So you've had the head of MI6 and the previous head of the CIA coming out and talking about this reckless campaign of sabotage that they accused the Russian intelligence services of waging across Europe. And for NATO, it's been grappling with how does it respond to that? How does it deter? Like, deterrence in a conventional way is well understood, and the nuclear deterrence is well understood.
So interesting.
But below the threshold, it's not so well understood.
So don't bank on it, basically. I'm going to rattle through a couple of questions now, because we've got so many good ones. I want to make sure we get through as many as possible. So Paul M has asked, is the UK capable of repelling the type of drone and missile attacks we see on Ukraine on a daily basis?
I think not necessarily, right?
Not at the moment, no. No, it's not.
No.
Quick answer, no.
Yeah, we don't want to
obviously
but...
it has capability. It has capability, and it's expanding that capability. So it's not that it hasn't got a capability. I think one of the big weaknesses is ballistic missiles. I mean, that's not a secret. The only way that the UK can defend against a ballistic missile, which is the sort of massive, great lump of metal that can go out of the Earth's atmosphere and descend down at great speed, are Type 45 destroyers, warships, and we only have 6 of them, and not all of them are at sea at one time.
So Ben has asked, do you think the British public would be enlisted for service, and what ages? I mean, this is a key. I mean, this is what a lot of people will be worrying about, particularly Ben, perhaps. Like, is he going to get called up?
I suppose in the war game, what we play out is sort of the first 8 or 9 hours of a scenario. So within the confines of our war game, it's still sort of in the first week of this kicking off. But you just have to look at what's happening in Ukraine, I suppose.
It's hard to say anything with it.
Well, I think the thing to say in response to that question is, so it's not about sort of, Rishi Sunak had a disaster when he launched his election campaign with this sort of national, talking about sort of getting young people to do national service, which didn't go down very well, and it wasn't very well considered at all in terms of the way it was presented. But countries like the Nordic countries, they have really well established programmes to get, it's elite. People want, they compete to get in and not just sort of military service, but different forms of government service for a year before they go carry on with the rest of their lives. And I think the important thing when it comes to thinking about war is that an expert said to me, it's armed forces fight battles, countries fight war.
Well, on countries fighting a war, Kiefer has asked, should we be a nation of preppers? Should we be getting, ready kits of supplies, for example? What do you reckon?
Well, it is interesting, Dev's mentioned Rishi Sunak. On the first day, it was the day that he called the election, they launched this Prepare website. And if you go on the Prepare website, which I think probably most people have not had a look at, it does recommend, you should keep bottled water, tins of food, you should have a wind-up radio.
What, in the UK?
They launched it literally on the day that Rishi Sunak announced the election.
I've never heard of this. I find this staggering. What, that you should be keeping bottled water in the house? And...
Yeah, like 72 hours worth of water, a wind-up radio, wind-up torches. But the interesting thing is... Which
I actually can't flabbergasted.
The lack of...
You should see my fridge. I've got like kind of half a tin of sweet corn and some chicken that went off 2 days ago.
But it's only online. I mean, if the power goes off, no one's going to be able to look at their prepping website.
Yeah.
So, whereas in countries like Sweden, they have printed documents like we used to have in the Cold War of, sort of just setting out a few sensible things to do.
It's extraordinary.
And it's not about tin hats and things like that. It's just about sensible recommendations in case, even like we saw in Spain when the power went out.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's definitely a good point. Wal Julie asks, if there was an attack, how are civilians informed? Would it be phones? Would it be sirens? How do we know?
It's one of the things we looked at for the podcast is, if you're a listener, if you imagine that you're kind of in the world of the war game, how do you find out? And so we looked at the emergency alert system, which, if you remember, it was tested on all of our phones about, was it 18 months ago or something?
I remember this, yeah.
So that's probably the first sound of the UK at war that a normal civilian would hear rather than a kind of an air raid siren.
If the phones work. And again, that's where's the resilience? Like in Ukraine, there are these air raid sirens that you hear when there's incoming drones and missiles.
Yeah.
I mean, the UK during the Cold War had like a lot of air raids, which, and goodness knows what's happened to them.
That's a good point, isn't it? It's all these things you just take for granted that you start thinking about in a completely different way. So the final views question that we've got coming in is from D187. Would an attack on the UK be physical or digital? How is war defined in 2025? I mean, again, it's kind of come back to what you were saying earlier, I think, doesn't it? About how war isn't just about missiles, it's also about a whole load of other stuff too.
Yeah, it's probably hybrid, isn't it? Because so much of our lives depends on the digital side of things. And so it's, it might be that you start to see cyber attacks on kind of government infrastructure, which could be, it could be traffic lights, it could be hospitals, it could be all sorts of parts of our lives.
Also space is another dimension. I mean, war has always had different hybrid dimensions. That's not anything new. Like disinformation has been around for the ages. The difference is the amplification factor when it comes to social media platforms, the internet. And so the way that technology is advancing, it creates new capabilities to wage war and also to cause harm. And I think, taking out satellites, for example, that would cause absolute chaos for the civilian population as much as bombs and bullets.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, these questions have been amazing, so thank you so much for sending them in. I think it really shows how engaged people are in this issue, how interested they are, how worried they are, frankly, as well. Can I just ask a couple of questions on my own just to finish? Because I'm really fascinated by how it was putting together this podcast. James, to you first, because you said that you're not like a kind of military specialist like kind of Debs, but what do you feel like you've learned most? What's sort of surprised or shocked you in the journey of doing this and listening to all these people coming together and wargaming?
I mean, it was. It's one thing to just see those people in a Cobra meeting and see how they all operate, because we normally never get a view into that world. How do they respond to a crisis situation? How do they make decisions? What does the National Security Advisor do? What's the Prime Minister's role in all of it? I mean, in terms of the defence topics, I didn't quite realise that our defences were quite as weak as they are.
That's interesting. That's not what I was hoping you were going to say. You'd be like, I thought it was all going to be fine. It's like...
I mean, I was so shocked to learn, Deb's mentioned that the Type 45 destroyers that can shoot down ballistic missiles, one of them's been in service longer than it's been at sea. It's been in repair for 8 years.
Wow.
And so things like that sort of surprised me, but also all the things that our Russia team get up to. They're full of surprises. It doesn't quite unfold as you might expect.
And Debs, what about you? And I know you're such an expert in this area. Has there been anything that has surprised you? I
think for me it was more about the actual game itself and the dilemmas that are thrown up and the impact of the uncertainty when it comes to the American position. That throws up such a huge cluster of problems and challenges that really need to be talked about. That was something. And then in terms of the actual physics of the game, it was so nerve-wracking to do, to ask all of these really important people to please come. When we had our Cobra room, we also had a smaller military headquarters filled with very senior, brilliant experts, and the Russian room. And so the big thing was, would they all show up?
It's been, honestly, such a joy to talk to both of you. Debs, I know personally what a big effort this has been. It's kind of taken over your life for however long, but I'm really excited to listen to it, and I feel like it's a really important educational thing for so many people as well. So thank you for doing the Q&A. And thanks for listening to the Q&A. Thanks for sending in your questions. I'm sure you'll be able to find, either Debs or James on their kind of social media channels, but do listen to the podcast, because I'll be honest, it has blown my mind already in just the conversations I've been having with these guys over the last, today, but also the last few weeks as well with Debs. It is extraordinary. Check it out. And if you've got any more questions, let us know.